Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on decarbonization. I'm Josh Green, and I will be the moderator for today's conversation. We'll wait one more minute, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, let's go ahead and jump into it. As I said, I'm Josh Green, and I'll be the moderator today. And first, a couple of notes in terms of how this conversation is going to go. First, we'll do some introductions. Then I will ask a series of questions of our Novata experts, Steve and Devika. And then towards the end, we'll have time for audience questions. So please, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the Q&A channel. There's a button on the bottom right of your Zoom screen. Please put those questions in as soon as you have them, and we'll get to them as quickly as we can. Also note that this will be recorded, so subsequent to the event, you'll get that recording sent to you, and looking forward to the conversation. So that's it in terms of notes. Let's do some introductions. I'll get us started. And first, welcome to everybody who may be new to Novata. Let me give you the quick overview of Novata. We are a company focused on providing sustainability solutions to the private markets. We were founded in 2021 by a consortium of both for-profit and nonprofit organizations. On the for-profit side, S&P Global, Hamilton Lane; on the nonprofit side, Ford Foundation and Omidyar Network. In the years since, folks like Microsoft, Northern Trust, Apollo have joined our consortium. And today we work with about 200 GPs around the world, collecting information from about 10,000 underlying companies. And our tools are being used to both collect the data, make sense of the data, and then ultimately to satisfy reporting obligations to stakeholders. Decarbonization is a topic that is very much on people's minds, and I'm really excited to have the conversation today. Before we get into it, let's do some introductions of the folks that are here. As I said, I'm Josh Green, one of the co-founders and chief operating officer of Novata, and in that capacity oversee both the creation of the product as well as the go-to-market and then the customer experience. Steve, let me hand it to you.
Thanks, Josh. So Steve Cain here. I'm a senior manager on the Novata advisory team. I'm actually coming up my 3 years here at Novata. I've been in the ESG and sustainability space for about 5 years, and then in climate collectively over 15. I actually started as a shark researcher and through some circuitous route made my way here. But I spend a lot of time supporting both investors and customers thinking through every step in the carbon journey. So everything from measurement to validating to thinking what to do with the data next and how to contextualize it when you're speaking with external stakeholders. So obviously I'm here to discuss decarbonization, but through the lens of having experience and exposure to many in the private markets across multiple strategies. So I've seen it all. And if you feel, today through our conversation that something is resonating, it's because we've had experience, likely the challenges that you're going through or the questions that you're thinking through are things that we've seen before. And I think with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Devika.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. My name is Devika Bhagwat. I'm a carbon analyst on Novata's advisory team. I started my career working in food tech, but after completing my master's in sustainability management, I pivoted to working in sustainability tech. That was about 3 years ago. I've been at Novata for about a year and a half now, and I work with investors and companies alike to help simplify their carbon journey from insights to action. I'm really glad to be a part of this session and looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
All right. Well, let's get into it, and let's start with talking about why and when decarbonization it should be something that folks take up. Obviously, we're at an interesting moment in the world of sustainability. There have been tailwinds for years in terms of pressures on investors and on companies to do more with respect to decarbonization. There's been some pushback over the last many months. So there are now what I would describe as crosswinds. blowing, but that makes it seemingly harder to figure out. I think if you're in the shoes of an investor or a company looking out at all the different frameworks and all the different possible paths that you could take, which one is the right one, and is now a moment to start down a decarbonization path. So, Steve, maybe you could get us started by talking to us a little bit about who should be thinking about decarbonization, when should they be thinking about it, and what are the good reasons to get going, and maybe what are the reasons that should give you pause?
I think that's a great question. And the framing is really helpful too to kick me off, which is this concept of tailwinds and crosswinds. And so I think everything that we're going to talk about today, I should preface by saying that really our job at Novata is to make sure that we're keeping track of all these things because the pace is pretty furious. Things change overnight. And so everything that we're going to discuss today is sort of best practices for this moment in time, with a keen eye and ear to future changes that could happen pretty quickly. So I think it's good to first off talk about what do investors actually mean when they say the D word or decarbonize. And I think this can mean a lot of things in practice. So we speak to a lot of people who come to us seeking some form of support for decarbonization, and they're asking us to support them in aligning with, say, decarbonization frameworks. We're going to talk about a few of them today. Or maybe it's setting science-based targets or science-aligned targets. And that can either be for portfolio companies or at the company level. But they also ask us this really hard question, which I hope we get a chance to get into today, which is, identifying ways to reduce emissions. Because I think a lot of us get to this point where we're like, well, how much control and like what can we actually do to reduce this stuff? So I think that's sort of helpful to think about. But the right path and the right timing is really going to depend on the drivers behind decarbonization. And so I think we'll be thinking about, what are the factors that are influencing you to even participate in this webinar today? Why are you interested in this topic? I want to tell you, though, having worked with dozens of investors, hundreds of companies, that we tend to see these three broad buckets of investors who are pursuing decarbonization. I think that's really true for where we're at in 2025. And so first, and this is probably the simplest driver to understand, there's going to be those GPs or investors who are simply told to do it. These are GPs who are responding to LP pressure, and these LPs are expecting to see, among other things, net zero roadmaps. They want to see climate targets. They want to see SBTI commitments as a part of fund level disclosures. So that driver is actually pretty easily understood. There's a second group of investors, and these are what I would suggest are investors who already have a decarbonization story to tell. And this kind of comes in two sub-flavors. So maybe they already have a portfolio of lean assets or lean asset-like companies in sectors where they don't actually produce a lot of carbon emissions in the first place. And then the second group is like maybe these are climate forward solutions that create efficiencies and have a really good story to tell around decarbonization, not just through the products and services that they offer, but actually operationally how they run. And these, they also might have concentrated ownership and different levers to pull, like board influence, which is then going to make company level action a little bit more feasible. And so these GPs have properly assessed that the situation they're in is like, look, we're already doing a lot of things that we should get credit for. Using a decarbonization framework or making a public commitment just kind of solidifies the great work that we're already doing. And then I think there's this third group, which probably has a lot of overlap with the second group, which is these are investors who just at face value think decarbonization is a good idea because to them it's responsible investing, it's tied to long-term value creation. They may not even be seeing the pressure from LPs that we're seeing elsewhere. And maybe their portfolio isn't as obviously aligned with decarbonization as group two, but they kind of see the writing on the wall, even amidst these crosswinds, and they want to be proactive about it. But if you boil it down, the three groups, like what's the commonality between them? And it's interesting because as much as, the pushback, the blowback, the crosswinds, as much has been said over the course of several years, it still remains pretty true that the reason why decarbonization is important to investors is that it just gives you access to capital.
Okay, that's a really helpful starting point. So access to capital is the common thread. You've got folks that are feeling the pressure, folks who have a good story to tell, and then folks who are future proofing. They can see that this is where the world is heading. Let's say you're sitting in this webinar and you're thinking, okay, I'm in one of these groups and I need to get going, or maybe I've been told I have to get going. There's an alphabet soup of standards and frameworks that are out there. Uh, what's the right starting point? How do you think about which framework or which standard you should be aligning to?
That's a great question. So there's a lot of them, and we don't have time to cover them all today, but I think we want to cover the ones that people bring up to us pretty often. And a good starting place is to name the elephant in the room when it comes to decarbonization, or something that often gets tied as synonymous to decarbonization, which is the Science-Based Target Initiative. That's the one that most often comes up the most. We should like define what it actually is. It's a voluntary initiative. You sign up and you make a commitment, a net zero commitment, something that's been widely publicized over the last couple of years to reduce your emissions in line with a net zero strategy, right? And for general partners in private equity, there's actually specific guidance from or for private equity to actually do this, and it helps guides GPs to do this. But when we say decarbonizing an investor, it's probably worth just explaining what that is. So if you're an investor and you're decarbonizing, that means that you're measuring your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and you're attempting to reduce those emissions in line with a credible target, right? But if I'm an investor, maybe I have 15 people in an office somewhere. So I'm pretty asset light. I have computers. Maybe I have people traveling and doing business travel, but far and away, the biggest source of emissions for investors is going to be financed emissions. And what are financed emissions? Financed emissions are the scope 1 and 2 emissions of your investee companies. And so setting a science-based target to reduce these emissions is another way of saying, what can I do to influence my portfolio to reduce their emissions? And in order to do that, there's actually 3 hard paths that have different, implications. So in order to decarbonize a portfolio of diverse assets, you can, one, according to science-based targets, set a goal of portfolio coverage. So 60% of my portfolio companies are, setting their own science-based targets with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and they're actively working to try to reduce their emissions by 2030 and then be net zero by 2050. That's one way to go about it. A second option is you have this so-called temperature rating. You've got really good data on your companies, and more or less, whether they're meeting their targets, and then you take a weighted average of this temperature score across the portfolio. And then the third, which may at first blush sound pretty easy, but actually isn't, is this engagement target. So it's sort of asking you, can you commit to actively engaging 90 to 100% of your portfolio companies, encourage them to set a science-based target? But as we're kind of going to discuss in a little bit more detail here, this is really tough, and it kind of presupposes that you've got a lot of good data in place. And so just, to bring it to close here, SBTI is the one thing that everybody's going to be thinking about. I think where we'd like to pivot now and discuss is that in a sea of other, frameworks in voluntary initiatives that we can think about, what are steps that we can do along the way that either set us up for success in setting a science-based target, or maybe they are more appropriate for just who we are as an investor. So I think for that, I'd like to pass it over to Devika, who's going to talk about 2 decarbonization frameworks that we are encountering quite a bit right now. So Devika, I wonder if I can pass it to you.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. So we're going to be discussing private markets decarbonization roadmap and the Net Zero Investment Framework, or NZIF. So both these frameworks are very closely aligned. Think of them as maturity models that you can rank your company's performance along a spectrum of taking no action to a competitive advantage. They differ only in a few metrics, and I would say that if you're collecting data for one of the frameworks, it should be pretty easy to meet the requirements of the other. Essentially, PMDR focuses on decarbonization of high impact sectors in the private markets, and NZIF focuses on comprehensive alignment with net zero for different asset classes. But like we were discussing before, the important thing is to understand is that all of these frameworks lead to the same goal, building a credible, measurable decarbonization pathway. The difference lies in how they get there, the metrics they prioritize, the level of detail they require, and the type of organization they're best suited for, I think, yeah.
Devika, can I push you on this and ask, in terms of these two different frameworks, PMDR and NZIF, pros and cons of going down one path versus the other? Is one just better than the other, or is it, one is right for a certain set of folks and the other is right for a different set?
Yeah, so like I said before, each framework has its pros and cons depending on your business model, maturity, your stakeholder needs. But the key takeaway is to understand that you have to first understand what makes sense for you. One of the big part of setting an effective strategy is just to understand what your outlook towards this entire journey is. And when you start comparing these frameworks, you will notice that they share many common threads. I think the only major difference, if I have to pick on any, is that NZIF requires a public commitment, whereas PMDR has no public commitment. So, based on why you're choosing one framework over the other, I think it makes it an easy decision.
Got it. So if I'm trying to tell a story externally,
Mhm.
then it might make sense to do the NZIF. Whereas if I'm focused on doing the work because I think it drives inherent business value without the storytelling component, then PMDR might make more sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And okay, so that's a key difference. Talk to me a little bit more about the common threads. What's the overlap in terms of the work that you do if you go down one of these paths?
Yeah, so again, the bottom line is whenever investors are looking to decarbonize, irrespective of which framework they choose, SBTI, PMDR, or NZIF, one of the most common threads is trying to understand their own emissions footprint. And a starting point to build a comprehensive GHG inventory is getting data for all scopes, including scope 3. Now, here's a key insight. For most GPs, scope 3.15 emissions that Steve was talking about earlier, um, which represent emissions from the portfolio companies, can be over 700 times larger than their scope 1 and 2 emissions combined. So, in other words, more than 99% of a GP's total emissions come from their investments and not from their operations. So the emphasis is on calculating financed emissions, and that's the common thread. It's the clearest way to understand an investor's real climate impact, and it gives you a baseline to act on. Once you know where the emissions are coming from, you can start making decisions that I guess actually move the needle. So I would say the biggest and the most important common thread is financed emissions.
Okay, so financed emissions can seem overwhelming when you're thinking about collecting this data across your portfolio. Why don't we talk about how you get started down that path? Steve, maybe you can give us a sense of what the right starting point is.
Yeah, and we're going to throw so many things at you today. So let me just like plant financed emissions on a map. Where do they sit? So I think like if we've got SBTI, I'm successfully reducing emissions across my portfolio. I'm setting a science-based target. There's a lot of work that has to go in before you can even get there. And the first steps of that work is like I've measured a significant amount of my portfolio and I'm measuring GHG emissions, right? And I'm like pretty confident in the data quality that's coming through from my underlying companies across strategies, which is a whole nother challenge that we can talk about another day. But now you get to that point where you think, wow, I've got really good, robust portfolio coverage. And to me and to us, the obvious next step is, well, you should be calculating financed emissions. And financed emissions, as Devika points out, gives us this ability to analyze where your biggest, biggest aspect of your carbon footprint is. Once financed emissions are complete, they give us a bunch of useful metrics that we can then plug into various decarbonization frameworks and report out. So whether you're deciding that this is an exercise for internal performance management or external communication, we don't think that enough emphasis is actually really placed on financed emissions as being a key piece of this puzzle, which is why we're spending some time on it today. So practically, how do you get started with this? You might be rushing to get your 500-page copy of the greenhouse gas protocol. but actually we're relying on a different set of guidance here. It comes from something called the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, and I'll refer to it as PCAF from here on out. And PCAF is not perfect, but it's what we've got to work with today. And they've got a couple of asset classes that are applicable for private equity, private credit, and venture. And until dedicated private markets guidance comes out for these asset classes, we have some fallbacks that we can use, and we understand our way around their limitations and their uses. But I'll just say that, once you calculate your financed emissions, it kind of opens the door to, I would say, 3 critical portfolio level metrics that then get really useful when we start talking about planning to decarbonize. So the first metric that we get at the portfolio level is a weighted data quality score from PCAF. And this kind of tells you how reliable your emissions data is across your portfolio. If you've got hundreds of companies, there's no way you're spending the time or even paying a consultant to go through every single report. There's no way you're going to know with specificity what's happening. And when you score your companies using the PCAF methodology, you kind of understand where actual estimates are being provided, where the use of proxies are standing in for data gaps and things of that nature. And ultimately, that helps us understand when we're making decisions just how good the underlying data is. The second metric is emissions intensity. And this kind of helps you understand your exposure relative to capital deployed. And then the last metric is something called WACI. It's got a funny name, and it's weighted average carbon intensity. And this shows per million in company revenue, your weighted investment exposure. And this is a metric that is pretty standard for benchmarking. So oftentimes LPs will be requesting this figure of you in addition to your SBTI commitment letter or anything like that. And people will go, okay, I need to produce WACI. And they totally miss the fact that we've got to do financed emissions. We've got to calculate financed emissions in order to produce this WACI figure that actually gets used to benchmark your performance. But just to bring it all home, practically speaking, what these metrics allow you to do is they really just help you prioritize. They tell you where emissions exposure is most concentrated in your portfolio. They tell you which companies have strong or weak data. And then they tell you where carbon intensity is kind of out of step based on the expectations of the sector or the industry.
Okay, that's a lot. Thank you, Steve. And certainly, we know that some folks go it alone in going on this journey. We also work with a number of clients and support them when they're going down the path of calculating financed emissions. Devika, can you talk to us a little bit about what that looks like and what some of your experiences have been in terms of working with clients on this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you said before, we work with investors across different asset classes to help them understand their climate exposure and then align with the most appropriate decarbonization framework. So the beginning of this journey is starting the data collection process. We need 2 types of data, predominantly financial data and carbon data. On the financial side, essentially what we're trying to figure out is what your financial stake in each portfolio company within the portfolio is. This is where the concept of an attribution factor comes in. Attribution factor helps determine what portion of a company's emissions should be attributed to the client or the investor. Now, depending on which asset class we're working with, the exact data required will differ. It could be outstanding amount, EVIC, or enterprise value, including cash, shareholding, or other financial indicators. But across the board, the goal is the same. We need to understand the level of exposure and how much of each company's emissions are you responsible for. And then on the carbon data front, we specifically need the scope 1 and 2 emissions of a GP's portfolio companies, along with the PCAF data quality score that I think Steve referred to earlier. Scope 3 emissions are not mandatory, they're optional, but can be included if available. If a GP can engage portfolio companies to submit primary data directly through the Novata platform, that's even better. But if not, we can work with estimated emissions or GP provided data depending on what's available. So once that has been gathered, we calculate financed emissions and start pulling out useful insights. And then from there, based on the decarbonization framework that the client chooses, we use Novata's metric library of 3,000 plus metrics to collect, organize the relevant data, and we have built-in guidance. So answering these metrics becomes slightly easier. We also work with clients to then analyze this information so then they can extract the insights they need to make informed decisions and take action. So once we've gathered financed emissions data, the key metrics in the Novata platform, we use our expertise and organize it in the framework. Let's take PMDR classification tool as an example. Now, once all this is inputted in the classification tool, um, you can move forward and make decisions on your decarbonization pathway. Now, this process generally was probably done in Excel, but we're using technology and advisory support to streamline and improve it. And I think that's what makes it slightly more easier and less daunting, I would say.
Okay, so you have to understand the exposure, the stake that you have in companies. You have to collect data. Ideally, you're collecting data directly, but sometimes you can substitute in data. What are the hard parts? Where have you seen people run into challenges?
Yeah, we always come across these challenges, and that is data availability. See, the thing is, every GP is starting from a different place in terms of what data they actually have. So, our job is to work with what's available and make it usable. That means we often need to interpret and translate existing data into a format that aligns with PCAF's guidance and methodology. It's not always clean or complete, but we help make sense of it so it can be applied meaningfully within a decarbonization framework. Another challenge that we've experienced is that sometimes companies can misinterpret questions in these frameworks, especially without the full context. One of the more surprising things that we've seen in this process is that even some ESG data providers on our platform have, misread the intent behind the question, and then that leads to answers that don't quite align with what the framework is saying. That's why setting the right context is so important. When companies understand what a metric is really asking and why it matters, they're in a much better position to answer it accurately.
Okay. Well, thanks for going into the weeds on this. I want to pull back now and also, actually, before we go there, make a note. Now's the time. If you got questions, drop them in. I'm coming to the end of my questions, and then we'll start taking your questions. So click that Q&A button and drop a question in the chat. But Steve, want to lift us up a bit, and we talked about how people are going on this journey for different reasons, and a lot of times it's because they have to, because somebody is putting pressure on them to do this. But others, we know want to kind of stay ahead of the curve. And the question for you is, what does that mean? What does that look like over the next 12 to 24 months? If you were somebody who wanted to be on the cutting edge, who wanted to stay ahead of the curve, what would that look like?
Thanks, Josh. I think I'm probably going to answer for both groups, which is, thinking through how we can make this work for everyone. And so I think I want to point out that a really challenging moment for the concept of decarbonization is that I think there's a lot of confusion about what it really means to stay ahead of the curve. And a few years ago, if you asked most people, I think they might have told you that staying ahead of the curve was like this mad dash rush to set a portfolio wide SBTI as quickly as possible. But I think today people are rightfully more cautious because of the crosswinds that we previously mentioned. And I think they're recognizing a really simple fact that we just need to say out loud, which is setting a public target is not the same thing as successfully decarbonizing. I'll say that again. Setting a public commitment is not the same thing as decarbonization. And let me just talk a little bit about how that could potentially go a little bit awry. So, setting a target to me signals ambition. Like the one of the key benefits of using something like SBTIs to signal to the marketplace that you do take this seriously. But I want to touch upon, what can actually happen in practice, as we've seen through working with many investors and companies here at Novata. And I would say that, setting public commitments, they can introduce reputational risks if your targets are not met. And I also want to call out that it can produce operational risks if the process of setting a science-based target or going even on a low lift decarbonization framework is getting in the way of like day-to-day business for management teams. And then I would say, lastly, in some people, this might be first of mind, but from an emissions standpoint, if you're not really aligned on the why behind you're doing it, you can also misdirect effort to credibly decarbonize. If that motivation is not grounded in things like material, like, is this really actually something that I produce a lot of emissions on, or whether it's actually within my control to do so, that can actually take away from efforts to credibly decarbonize. And so I think something that kind of emerged for us and what we found to be the most successful is something that I'll just term the prioritization first approach. We've been talking a lot about the process of collecting carbon data, right? And it's still true. So it's true like it was in 2020 and 2023. It's true in 2025. And so, this starts with getting a solid greenhouse gas inventory, for as many companies as you can, if not all, right? My whole goal a lot of times with people is I call it, instead of racing to make the public commitment, it's like racing to get 100% portfolio coverage. What tools do I have to get you to 100% as quickly as I can, even if I'm filling gaps, right? And then what it gets tied to this is this idea of like quality and completeness. So like, what are the data quality scores associated with that? Can you improve the data quality across your portfolio as quickly as possible? And then I think after that, it's doing things like using financed emissions and these decarbonization frameworks, PMDR and NZIF, which just to boil them down to their simplest use case, they're maturity models, right? And so, we could leap straight to setting a target and then figure out how to build a plane while we're flying it. Or we can have really solid fundamentals to understand, what's happening. And so I think the outcome of this prioritization first approach might be that not every company in your portfolio is going to set a science-based target. And I think we would argue that that's okay. And I think, we just want to caution that the goal is not to check the box here. It's like to improve data, identify what matters, and actually, focus on engagement where you can actually drive some value. And if we take a step back from this, it might sound like it runs counter to the efforts of decarbonization or setting a science-based target, but it doesn't, because what we get from science-based targets, it's kind of a destination. And I think the challenge is that we're kind of skipping over the steps in between from measurement to actually achieving credible science-based targets. Because what's happening is that we're cramming a lot into just a few annual check-ins with portfolio companies. And the result is that we're getting data that we can't fully trust. And I should really point out that this data that we can't fully trust is the same data that we're then plugging into reports to talk about our science-based targets. So it's a chicken and egg problem. If we look at reports from the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, and SBTI, they seem to back up this thesis that I'm putting out, which is year over year, we see consistent things in these annual reports. There's two persistent problems that are really preventing us from moving forward on decarbonization. And number one is companies are still not disclosing all material sources of emissions. So don't even have a full inventory for the companies that we're looking at, right? And then number two is many companies are falling short of the targets that they've already set. And that's against inventories that are not even fully fleshed out yet, right? So I think, to kind of bring it back, what does staying ahead mean right now? I think that means prioritizing who embarks on decarbonization efforts based on their maturity, your level of influence, their emissions intensity, their performance relative to benchmarks. And we think that this is going to be a little bit more achievable and reflects how general partners are actually creating value at their portfolio companies. And to really crystallize this, I want to give you an example that happened to me recently, which is I worked with the portfolio company to measure their carbon emissions. And we were trying to find and unearth data for scope 2 emissions. That's the energy that you purchase. And we discovered a handful of accounts that the company had been paying for like a number of years that actually weren't really relevant. So it was like a billing error that popped up. And I think it's safe to say that this is not a company that embraced a lot of digitization around energy records. And so it had two immediate implications. And the first is, well, our emissions are going to drop if we're not, adding on energy usage from 3 phantom facilities that are not actually ours. And the second question, which is probably perking the ears of somebody in procurement or the finance team, is like, why are we paying these bills? And so they went back and they canceled those bills. So the process of creating a greenhouse gas data collection strategy was synonymous in this case with cost savings. And so that's where the rubber really meets the road. That is actually more reflective of what happens in private equity and private credit. And so I think that the key takeaway there is you can set a big, lofty commitment, but there's really no substitute for this prioritization first approach and in direct engagement with your companies. Because without it, we end up like doing decarbonization in name only, and we're passing through a bunch of company reported data that we don't really understand where it came from. And so I think, we're just left in that case with a binary yes or no. My company is meeting or missing its targets. And so, to kind of close this out, what should you be doing? I think if you are in the position of not having set a science-based target across your portfolio yet, then I think to us, staying ahead of the curve means really sticking the landing on carbon measurement fundamentals. And I'll just stress them again. It's achieving meaningful portfolio-wide coverage. Get as many companies as you can to report about carbon data. I think it's improving data quality iteratively. It's analyzing your portfolio with tools like financed emissions, and then basically ranking your companies against the maturity of models that are available to us with the decarbonization frameworks like PMDR and NZIF. And then if you're an investor going, well, I've already made the commitment, and what do I need to do? And I think it's actually still fair to say that it's not too late to return to this principle of strong data collection, because ultimately better data, better context, and better engagement with your companies is what's going to drive, and make those targets actually achievable that you've already committed to.
Okay, super helpful. And I think it's interesting. I think we went through a moment where there was such pressure to move on climate. It was leading a lot of people to jump to setting targets and making public commitments. And there's some good, I think, that comes from that. But I think there's also some good that comes from this moment that we're in, where people can take a more kind of thoughtful, nuanced approach. And Steve, in your framing, a prioritization first approach to make sure that you're really focused on what's meaningful. So super, super helpful. I want to take a beat and open up a poll for the group here today. If you're interested in learning more about Novata's solutions, either our technology or our advisory solutions, we have a place where you can click yes, I'd love a demo. If you are interested in a free trial of our Carbon Navigator solution, which is great for companies that are trying to take their first steps in doing their carbon inventory, click start a free trial of Carbon Navigator. And if none of the above is of interest to you, feel free to say no, thank you. So we'll leave that poll open and we'll take some questions. And want to start with one that came in. Have you thought about, or are you currently leveraging the ESG Data Convergence Initiative framework? And I can actually take that one. The Data Convergence Initiative is an initiative that is about 4 years old, got started around the same time as Novata, and has played a really important role in getting LPs and GPs aligned around the data that should be collected if you're getting started on your ESG journey. And in fact, we've seen a number of customers come to us specifically because they want to get started going down the path of collecting data for the ESG Data Convergence Initiative. And in fact, many of our most popular metrics, if you look at it, just the data in terms of which metrics are most frequently requested by GPs on our platform, it is the ESG Data Convergence Initiative metrics, followed closely by SFDR metrics. So yes, very much part of the Novata experience, and a lot of our customers are submitting data to that initiative, which we think is a great thing in terms of driving the industry forward. Got another one here. What, if any, do you see the role of AI in helping investors with decarbonization strategies? Steve, Devika, either of you have a thought on that?
Oh, actually, everybody in this webinar is actually really interested in the developments of AI. And so maybe I'll just briefly say is that I think initially maybe the first wave of AI advancements are going to come in smoothing out processes that have been long held manual processes. So I think we're just going to see measurement and improving measurement and data quality being like a result of some of the AI tools that are available to us today. And I think on the experimental front, yes, I think you're going to start seeing people to try to leverage these things to say, I've ingested a big data set of players in your space. This is what a typical company looks like for your size, shape, and color. And these, by the way, are all based on publicly available reports that we've ingested or whatever. These are the levers that we see them pulling. And so be curious to hear what anybody else on the panel thinks.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think AI, it should speed things up in terms of low-hanging fruit, right? I mean, you could go into ChatGPT and ask for some recommendations on how to decarbonize, and it'll probably give you some basics. And that's good. Like, great, let's get quick answers to basic things that you can do. I do think going to the place of getting to thoughtful strategies for how you can overhaul your business requires deep understanding of your business. And so surface level AI models probably aren't going to get there in the near term. There is, I should say, though, the flip side of AI, right, which is there's a lot of concern about the role that AI is playing in terms of consuming energy and generating emissions. And I think the question of how the AI industry decarbonizes and gets to a place where it's running on clean energy and not making the climate problem worse, I think it's an urgent question, which unfortunately I don't have great answers to. We're coming up on time. I do want to note that we will follow up with an email with the recording, and also for those who expressed interest in a demo or in a free trial, we'll follow up either with information in an email or reach out. We'll have one of our team members reach out to you. So look out for that. And then maybe one final question just to bring us home. In terms of the next step after target setting, Steve, I think you very clearly said, right, setting a goal is not really the end game here. And measuring emissions and setting goals, I think, are clearly first steps. But when it comes time to actually move the needle and drive down emissions in a significant way, how hard does that work?
I'm going to say and level with you all that it's really hard work. And maybe we bifurcate this in an oversimplistic sense. Like in a lot of the decarbonization frameworks, what I'm suggesting is when we're doing the hard work, we're shoulder to shoulder with our companies, we necessarily uncover operational efficiencies. And these are good, I think, at the margins. Whether they actually help you meet, say, a goal to reduce emissions by half by 2030, which is quickly approaching, or to be entirely net zero by 2050, the short answer is that's going to be insufficient. And so there are companies where this is actually going to be really applicable to tell a really positive story around decarbonization. And I would offer that those are companies where decarbonization is actually synonymous with the business model. They're aligned, they're inextricably linked because their product or service is more efficient. They've made some gains on that front. And I think for a lot of those companies, they're just in a better position. And so I think a really reasonable question to ask is, well, what if I'm in a difficult to abate sector? And what if I can't? And I think the answer is it's going to take, many levers for you to pull to try to get yourself out of the risk zone. And maybe that's all you can do. And so I think what I'll leave you with is that there's a great big space between people who are going to get a boost from this rapidly changing grid that's improving efficiency, and those people are kind of leading the pack and trying to align, their business model with decarbonization. There's a huge space between the two, but I think we just have to be clear-eyed and say the quiet part out loud is that not all companies are the same. Context matters, and I think if you're looking for a partner to help sort through, these questions, I think that's just something that we'd be really excited to do.
Okay, we'll leave it there with thanks, Steve, Devika. Thank you for the time and the insight today. Thanks everybody for taking the time out of your day to join us for a conversation today. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And for those of you who would like a helping hand on the decarbonization journey, as Steve said, we're here to help. Please feel free to reach out and have a great day.